So welcome everyone to today's social system mapping sense-making session for May 1st, 2023. For those of you who are new, what this is a vision about a possibility, the possibility being that social system mapping is a methodology and a tool that can help networks become self-organizing more quickly and become effective system change work more wisely and more quickly as well. So this is a learning opportunity for all of us to learn more about social system mapping, as well as the thinking and the theory that go into thinking that this is a good idea. And it is an opportunity for all of us because we all have different angles into what system change requires, as well as what works in different kind of contexts. And so it's a multilateral learning opportunity, and it also an opportunity to contribute your own experience and insight. It's a community of practice for those of us who are working to do mapping and to become always better and wiser mappers. And often there's a relationship to RMAP with this as well, though we're not going to jump into RMAP today. So for today, we're going to be, well, Lisa and I usually do some kind of HSD framework and sort of try to apply it to network weaving and to social system mapping. Today, we're going to use, look at a different new framework, not HSD. But so for today's objectives, as usual, we hope you'll come away with a sense of the potential that we're inspired by, and that you'll meet some cool folks and feel welcomed by them, the people who are part of this community, an integral part of the community. And that at a minimum, you go away at least a little bit curious about how social system mapping can support a network in learning how to deal with complexity, as well as in developing the relational web that is needed for a successful network, and that you'll see how we can explore useful frameworks to understand their underlying fundamentals and what they bring, and how to evaluate them, or just how to think about using them in your own context. So that's our goals for today. The agenda is we're going to do some introductions and framing. We're not going to update our maps. I guess I didn't edit this slide. We'll do a 5-minute breakout to let you get introduced to somebody new. We'll talk about some theory, then we'll go back into the same groups for breakout, and then we'll talk about some more theory. And then we'll have a review. As I can see, I didn't update my slides very well today, so hope you all forgive me for that. Okay, so let's go ahead and so I'm using Mentimeter as a slide deck, and let's start with some chat introductions. And Kara, I'm assuming you've put a link. The voting link is what we need in the, yeah. So today's voting link is in the chat. Let's have you go ahead and click on that link. And once you get to that link, there'll be a page where you can put in your name, your pronouns, location, and a network or networks that you're supporting in some way, all together in one comment field. And I'll give you a moment to do that. Are people able to access the slide deck? I'm assuming. Hey, Katie, welcome. Been a while. It's nice to see you. Oh, and then let me go. And I see Rebecca has joined us. Welcome, Rebecca. Okay, so thank you for that, and I hope that when we do our breakouts, you'll get to meet with you'll get put with someone you haven't met before. So that'll be Kara's little job, is to sort of intuit who's met who, which we'll do our best with. And welcome, Suzanne. Glad to have you joining us. And I just want to take a moment to appreciate all the really important contexts in which everyone is working and trying to make a difference. It's really always really it makes me happy to see just all the things people are doing. So going to the next slide. Okay, so then let's also put into here, just to start with, let's share a big challenge that you experience in doing collaborative work in networks. It's all over the place. Geographic areas, yes, and the technology needs, interest, resources. Yep. Well, those are integrating relationship flows with system complexity flows, yes, to transform the system. Different political agendas, different levels of risk tied to specific advocacy responses, sense making with clients, the mental shift. Leaders want to grow bigger, not deeper, reflection, not valued. Yeah, all of those groups, self-silo by size, location, politics, building trust, especially across those different silos. All big challenges, trust and initiative. Yep. Okay, well, let's hold those in mind a little bit as we, and seeing scale as the primary. Yeah. Yep. All of those are really, if you think about it, they are both relational challenges and systemic or complexity challenges, every one of them, except of course, everything, it's all over the place. I'm assuming that's an assumption I'm making because I don't know exactly what that means, but it sounds like both. Okay, thanks for that. So one of the things we want to just check in with everybody before we get too deep into this is just how familiar are you with social system mapping? Most of you that are here today are fairly, have been working with maps for a while and fairly familiar, but I want to just see if we have anybody who's totally in the land of I have no idea what you're talking about, so that we can do our best to help you feel comfortable and welcome without having to know everything ahead of time. And can't tell, 8 people. How many people do we have voting? 1, 2, 3. Okay, I think we've got everybody. Okay, so pretty familiar in general. And then we're gonna, as I said, we're gonna look at a new framework. We're not gonna dig deep into it, but we want to see if anyone is familiar with this framework already, the Emergent Learning Framework. It's brand new to me. It was Lisa has gotten intrigued by it recently and brought it up, and I had not seen it at all until this week when Lisa brought it up. And we're not going to be training the framework today. We're going to be using it as an example.
And Christine, I'm seeing in the poll you have HSD in there because we're typically doing HSD. So you could, I mean, if you've actually, it looks like most people aren't quite sure what we're
Well,
talking about, but we're just wondering if any of you have been exposed to it or had any training or use of it.
yeah.
So you
So
could use to swap out the HSD with emergent learning in the poll.
it is in the head, it is in the title, but you're right. I didn't actually look at the questions responses. So, but it looks like everybody's responding to the Emergent Learning Framework. Okay. So I'm going to just really quickly whip through, just as a reminder for all of us, that a social system map is a mashup of system mapping, stakeholder mapping, asset mapping, social network maps, and concept maps, all sort of mushed together. It's also a process more than a product. It's online, interactive, accessible to all network members in an ideal world, not always, but it's designed to be, and an iterative, emergent, dynamic, and ongoing collective practice. The big difference between a social system map and those other kinds of maps that I just mentioned is that as a mashup, a social system map has a lot more dimensionality and a lot more complexity and a lot more data in it than any of those other kinds of maps have. And so it can be overwhelming. It can be, there's so many ways of looking at it and sensing your way into it that it can be kind of a challenge to figure out where to start and what to do with it. So that's part of why we have these various sense-making sessions. The purpose of a social system map is it's about systemic transformation. So it's about supporting a global movement that I know you're all part of. Whether I know you or not, you wouldn't be here if you weren't. That's working to shift from systems of dominance, exploitation, and extraction to systems of connection, reverence, and regeneration. And I say this all the time, but well, in systemic transformation, we know we've been working at this long enough to know that systemic transformation requires strong networks of wise change agents. It's not just a project. Projects don't make systemic transformation themselves. Organizations don't. No one perspective on a system, no one piece of a system can transform the whole system. And so it requires networks of people across systems who are working wisely. So I like to say that there's two pieces to this shift, the relational shift from a separate self to an interbeing self, and a cognitive shift from a mechanistic worldview to a complex adaptive systems worldview. And what I kind of came up with, I have been saying this for a long time, that there are two shifts. And the fact of the matter is they're not two shifts. They're really different angles into the same thing. So we might be framing it as a relational shift, and we might be framing it as a cognitive shift, but there's no point in trying to sort of separate out and saying, well, this behavior is a relational thing and this behavior is a systemic thing, because in fact, they're the same thing. They're just different ways of looking at that whole big mess of system change using networks. They're both of them are necessary. And so I've been saying the two for quite a while, and recently it became clear to me that that they're really not two, but and so they're basically like this picture. If you're looking at this little truncated, this little short cone from the direction of this light, the blue light, it looks like a diamond or it looks like a square. It's got corners. And if you look at it from this angle, it looks like a circle, and it's got curves. And so the thing that I've been really thinking about lately is, okay, if it's one thing and we're just, I'm talking about it from two different angles, but I'm talking about the one thing, why do I bother separating it out into the two different angles? Why do I sort of hammer on this? You know, there's the relational shift and the cognitive shift, and we need to do both. And why am I doing that? And the reason I'm doing that is because if we look at this picture example, for instance, if we look at it from the angle of the blue light, we see corners, and we see one thing. And if we look at it from the other way, we see the other thing. But if we only look at it from one angle ever, each angle obscures truths about the other angle. So if we're looking from the blue angle, we see corners and we see no curves. So we'll say, no, there's no curves in this thing. Whereas if we look at it from the angle of the yellow light, we'll see only curves and we'll say, no, there's no corners. There's no pointy sides to this. I don't know what you're talking about when you're referring to pointy sides. And so either they're both true, it's the same thing, but looking at it from different angles enables us to see things that we can't see from the other side. Just like if we think about, particles and waves, if we're looking for particles, light as a particle or a wave, if we're looking for particles, we'll see particles, and that will make it hard for us to understand the dynamics of light as a wave and how that impacts us. And vice versa, if we're looking for waves, it will obscure for us the reality that there are particles also. And so this obscuring is what I realize is why I'm always sort of hammering on these two things, is because we need to always be looking at both. And I am always pushing us to if we're attending from one angle, to look also from the other angle over and over and over again. Because the other piece of this puzzle is that this is a static picture, but in our networks, everything is changing all the time. So it might be that, we understood the size of the square the last time we looked at it, but when we look at it again, we might see that it's shrunk, or it's grown a whole lot, or its color has changed, or whatever. So everything is shifting. We have to constantly be sort of doing this back and forth, back and forth. So,
Christine.
Yes.
I'm sitting here trying to think of an example of networks I worked with where, like, if we could provide an example within a network or a social system of when this, like, just an example of when it happened recently.
I don't tend to think in so much in specific examples, but in trends or in patterns that I see.
Yeah.
A pattern that I see is looking at, I mean, just as a simple one, the relational principle of building trust, and not, which is important, but sometimes we're trying to build, I don't think that's a good one. This is a prize question. If anybody else has a quick, and I appreciate that, Lisa.
Yeah, I should have given you opportunity to just move on and not answer the question, but I'm thinking to help relate it to a network I'm thinking of. Well, I don't know. So I'm going to try one and you help me. Okay. So a network I'm in, which has the different political agendas in the different locations, there's a very strong sense that we should use the relationship trust we built in that network to speak out if people are being politically ostracized or up to being imprisoned. And that is kind of one side of it. But the other side is, there's some other side that we miss if we just focus on that part, the voice part. Like there's some kind of systemic piece we're missing. And so it's sort of an unformed example, but it just maybe is something we can all be thinking about, of the two different, like what are different, and we're going to show an example coming up of two different ways to look at something, and a way one obscures the other is the big aha as you're describing this for me. I'm like, oh yeah, we need those two mindset shifts whenever you talk about it, but it's the obscuring and hiding the other one even that makes it interesting to me. Yeah.
So let's invite everyone to be thinking about what's an example of that they, in their context.
Yeah.
Maybe that could be the breakout question.
I'll keep thinking I might kind of get there eventually by the end today. Okay. We'll let you keep going.
Okay. Well, so the point of a social system map is to both be working at both of those levels, the relational level. So you can see lots of connections here in this picture of a map. We're building relationships, and we're trying to understand how the relationships fit into the broader context, into the systemic elements. And so a social system map is both a tool for helping us to generate relationships, but it's also a tool for us to use to collect, to learn together more about systems and complexity. So in other words, we can use it for both the cognitive shift and the relational shift. And that is what we're trying to all of us learn into, how to create methods and activities that support both of those shifts using a social system app. So that's, I think that's where, here's where we would pause and do a 5-minute breakout. So Lisa, do you have thoughts? Did you want to, should we change the prompt? I mean, I think I'm going to stop.
This is good. Yes, this is good.
Okay. So any question, let me stop sharing my screen for a second. Any questions coming up for anybody that we should address before we put you in breakouts? And Kara, I don't think we said how the size of the breakout groups.
We didn't. And so I either have 3 groups of 3, not including Denise, if she's not going to be on audio, or I can put Denise in a group of one of these groups of 3. We would have 1 group of 4.
Let's just go ahead and do the 3 groups of 3, and then we'll check in with Denise and we can move her into a group if we can tell her who's in the groups and she can say, I want to go into that one.
Okay.
Yeah. Or you can just.
Awesome. Then I am set to go.
Welcome back, everyone. Okay, just checking okay, great, welcome back. So I'm going to just talk briefly about how our theory of change in our particular community of practice, about how we believe that social system mapping can help with both of those shifts that I'm referring to. I'm going to share my screen and walk you through what we call, this is our new thing, our explainer. You might hear it as our explainer graphic, you might hear it referred to as our vortex, and you might hear it referred to as our theory of change, or our theory of transformation. But if you haven't seen this yet, I'm going to do a really sort of quick version. But so this is, there's a group of people, they have some kind of intention in common or something in common. Maybe it's identities, maybe it's a way of trying to create change in the world, maybe it's a specific change in the world, whatever. There will be a group of people, and this is pre-map. This is sort of like before map happens. Some kind of group of people that have something in common, and they may know each other, they may not know each other, they may be already working and coordinating, they might not, but in any case, at some point, someone in this group starts to feel like, or some few people in this group start to feel like, this is really important what we're doing, and we want to like ripple this change that we're bringing, or this work that we're doing, out into the world and have a greater effect than at the scale that we're currently having this effect. And so some small subset of the people who are looking, having this commonality, shared purpose, whatever it is, will say, let's get intentional and let's connect all these people up. Let's build a network, or let's make this a community and start to do things together and learn together and be able to create those ripples. So this subset will sort of take on some initial responsibility to make that happen. So they'll gather, they'll start to have meetings to talk about how to do this. This might be the staff of a network, a new network, or this is an existing network with a staff. It might be just people who are part of the network on the ground. Could be anybody, but they take on a responsibility. Oops. Oh my God. Wait. See if this works. No. Okay. Give me just a moment. I'll get that slide from somewhere else quickly. This might not be the best copy, but I'm just going to go with it. Nope, that's not it. Sorry. Okay. Okay. There we go. Okay, so we were here. This group is starting to convene themselves, have meetings themselves. This little purple swath is a clue that they're doing something and starting to plan for a way to create this community of this network. They start to do things with the network as well. So they've got some kind of action going on between their planning efforts and bringing the community together to introduce them, to start to share thinking about how can we build this, what would be important, et cetera. So this, again, these purple sort of loops are interactions between the people who take on the responsibility and the rest of the community. At some point, this group of people is going to start to say, there's things we don't know. We need to see more. We need to see who's doing what. We need to see who has what perspective. We need to see some more stuff that we just can't see. So they'll start to have this vision of the stuff that they want to see. And so this is just represented up here as a vision of a map of some sort. And in fact, it often does become an understanding of the fact that they could build a social system map, which would show them a lot of the elements of the things that they're trying to see. Not everything, but a lot more than they can see without that map. And once they get to that point, they discover there's a social system map possibility. They start to work to create a social system map. In this map, the data will come from and be gathered from the people on the ground. It will go into the map. It will be a reflection. So this is a little bit of a mirror of this population on the ground. And then the population on the ground has access to the map. So that's sort of our first iteration of a social system map. How this data gets defined, like the questions that get asked, questions being very powerful. We want to like over time make our questions more and more aligned with the purpose and the context. But at first we start where we can, because it's impossible to get all these people to be, not impossible, but it's often very challenging to get all of these people totally psyched about making this abstract thing that they've never seen before, and they don't really get how it would be helpful to them. So we start where we can with as much input from as many different perspectives as we can, recognizing that most of the time it's not enough, but we need to start somewhere so that people can see what it is. From that point, oops, I'm going in the wrong direction. That will help some of the people who are looking at this map and sense making with the map, or starting to see possibilities, get more involved in taking responsibility for the community. Then out of that, we'll start to say, oh, we didn't get states. Where are people located geographically? We didn't ask certain questions. So we'll update the map and ask again for information. And this update will be a little bit more in alignment with the intentions of the whole. And we'll do that. And at some point, it'll start to be that, so this orange brush stroke is really about not just looking at the map as a way of convening or as a way of creating relationships, but also as a way of understanding the system of the network or the community itself, as well as potentially the system beyond the community that the network is trying to have an influence on. So we start to do some more systemic, complexity informed thinking and sense making using the map. And that again brings up new questions, such as, oh, we didn't think of, all of these perspectives that exist in this system, and we should add some questions about that or whatever. So we start to have new questions that come up. We revise, we add those to the survey, we question again, and then everybody can see that. So the content of the map is becoming more and more targeted and relevant and aligned with the actual needs of that specific context and that specific purpose. I keep going to the wrong place to push the slide forward. Over time, the questions get more and more aligned. We continue to ask people to answer the questions and input their data, and there gets to be more and more data that you can see. There gets to be a richer, the mirror of this group gets to be more and more, it's never going to be anywhere near reality, that level of complexity or accuracy, but it's going to get clearer and clearer over time as there's more data in there and as the questions are better, which gives more and more capacity for doing good systemic sense making. And in the end, this is our sort of hypothesized ideal final state when the data in the map just aligns very closely with the relationship building, as well as the sense making and the purpose of the overall community of practice. So that's our theory of, and it's informed from a lot from lots of social system or systemic complexity thinking principles, as well as a big piece of it is informed by the human systems dynamics theory of change, about how change happens in complex systems. And I just want to voice appreciation for Mary Roscoe, who's on the call, and Brian Dowling and Jim Best, who worked with me and with a graphic designer on this for nearly a year to really think through our theory. So that's that. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. Lisa, are you seeing anything coming up that we should, looks like we're, okay. I'm finding my place in the thing. Okay, so that's our theory of change. And then that's very super high level. And Lisa is going to share with you some thoughts that we had this week as we were preparing for this session about a new model for some ways of, so there's like, we have this big theory of change, and then, and we have all these sort of big complexity thinking principles. And our challenge as a network and as mappers is how to apply all of this thinking in our actual contexts. How do we actually take this from an abstract theory into actual practice? And so that's what these sense-making sessions are for. And we were going to look at a new potential application way of applying. And I'm going to hand it over to Lisa for that.
Yeah, and we've been in these sense-making sessions. We've been primarily using methods and models from human systems dynamics to help us with sense making of our social system and our social system maps. And so as Christine and I were preparing for this session, we were trying to kind of figure out which model or method we might use. And I asked her if she'd heard of emergent learning. And we kind of started to explore that and realized neither of us know it well. I'm a little bit exposed to it. I'm going to give you a little background to it. But then we thought, well, this would be a good time to actually, there are so many tools out there for dynamic change, for complexity thinking that can be available to us to help with sense making with our social systems. And so let's use this session actually to say, how would you explore if you get a new model that comes to you? How do we look at that? How do we see if that might be useful to us? Because neither of us are in depth in this model, we thought we would use it as an example to say, let's explore a new model together. So we're going to use the emergent learning model as our example for that, and just do some exploring together of how this might be useful to us for our social systems. So emergent learning, I'm going to ask Kara to just put the first, can you put the first link up, the homepage link into the chat? And it looked like at least one of you have heard of it. And if any of you have any experience with it, please join in with this conversation. It comes from my understanding, I mean, there's a group called Fourth Quadrant Partners who've developed the model, and it comes from providing principles, practices, and tools for developmental evaluation. So my understanding is it's more from the evaluation field. So utilization focused or developmental evaluation, which is really evaluation practices that help us with our learning as we go. And we know this is something that's really important in our networks. And so the model has principles, it has practices, and then it has different ways you can have conversation to really embed learning into your group. A lot of it's organization focused, but it really applies to any complex system. I'm going to give you just a definition that I found of emergent learning. I'm going to put it in the chat. I'm going to give you a little bit more background of it. Let's see if I can get that in there. It's not letting me cut and paste in the chat.
Weird. Let me see if I can.
It's not letting, oh, there we go. It just was a little delay.
Okay.
I've seen this mostly being used in the field of philanthropy. So I've seen foundations and philanthropic agencies trying to use this to help with the ongoing learning when they have such diverse knowledge bases across their grant making and all the different organizations they're supporting. And so you'll see there's just a definition in there I put in the chat. Emergent learning is a philosophy and practice that values maintaining communal spaces where people can safely learn, practice, explore, and make mistakes in the pursuit of building knowledge and skills. So as Christine and I were digging into this, looking at the principles, we're like, where should we start? Would principles be helpful for, would this be a helpful tool? You know, like we're starting to put that question together of, would this be a useful framework to help do sense making with social systems? And so we started digging in. We looked at the principles, and Kara put that link up there. Then we looked at some of the practices, which is what my exposure has been. And Kara, could you put that link in there too, so you can
Lisa,
see?
would it be helpful just for to screen share just those pages for if anybody's not?
Yeah, I can do that. Yep. Let me just do that. You see in the practices page?
Yep.
Okay. Let me just get this a little back to formatted so I can see all of you too. And then you'll see under the practices page, you'll see there's questions, action hypotheses, before and after action reviews. And some of these tools are actually from different fields, right? So we know that before and after action reviews actually come from the military. They've learned that this is a really good process to help quick assessments when you need to do quick adaptive assessments, the table conversations, learning logs. And so I'm going to back up just so you, because I wasn't sharing before. Here are all the principles of emergent learning, which a lot of them, I don't know about you, but when I think about a network, they really make intuitive sense when I read this to help a network develop. So there's the principles, there's the practices, and then there's specific practices that seem like they might be especially useful. So that's just a little bit of the lay of the land of this emergent learning framework model, whatever we call it. And let me just show one more practice, the one that I've found helpful. It's called the Emergent Learning Table. And this one is if you have a question you're posing for your network. So this might be a really great place. Like I could see this being a helpful tool for sense making. As we asked you, one of the first questions we always ask is, what's one of your biggest challenges with your network as you come into this session? And it would be interesting to do this learning process. And it could be with a core group of people from your network, or you can invite others into it. What will it take to and address that challenge you're having? And then it shows a way to look at both past information and question into the future. And so that is something that looks potentially useful. I've seen it kind of break open some ideas. And of course, I'm putting it into HSD mode where it breaks open the differences that make a difference, or we can find some opportunity to move forward with our challenges. So I'm going to just stop for a minute, check in with Christine. Just wanted to give you the lay of the land. And then we thought we'd dig into one of the principles to just kind of look at that and see if that would be useful for sense making.
Well, can you stop sharing so I can? Yeah, great, thanks. So one of the things that came up for me as we were looking at this and trying to figure out where to start, I was looking at some of the principles and then I was like, oh, this is great. But then when I was digging in a little deeper, I was like, okay, but it doesn't quite fit our context, or this is great, but there's a slight difference. Like there's a slight not fit, which doesn't make the principle or the practice bad by any means. But what I started to realize was this was bringing up for me is the difference between recipes and understanding the science of cooking. And we've talked about that before in smaller groups in our community practice, but we're in this historical shift from, from the we hopefully are in this historical shift. We're trying to create this historical shift and support it, of systems of dominance to systems of connection, or mechanistic thinking to complexity thinking, or living systems thinking. And so keeping in mind the difference between recipes and the underlying science of cooking is really, I find really important, because recipes are great. And if if it fits, and you've got everyone can eat everything in the recipe, and you've got all the ingredients, and you don't have a lot of time, and you can do a recipe over and over and over so that you have it memorized and you don't have to consult your recipe book, that, we love recipes, and they might make life easier. But if we have recipes that, if we have suddenly we're cooking for people who can't eat some of the ingredients, they have food sensitivities, or they have whatever kind of limitations, or they're used to and prefer a totally different sort of flavor palette, or you don't have some of the ingredients. When any of those kinds of things come up, if you understand the underlying fundamentals of why this works, why that's necessary, why that doesn't help, the underlying science of cooking, if you will, then you're able to pivot, to adapt, to adjust things, and you're also able to come up with recipes from scratch. If there's some concept that you have and you want to try something like relatively new, and there aren't recipes for it, you can make a recipe if you have the underlying fundamentals. And so I was sort of looking at this, and I was like, yeah, this is all clearly, implicitly systems thinking informed, but it's not explicitly systems thinking or complexity thinking informed. And so that makes me think about what is missing if we just jump into a recipe book. It looks like a great recipe book. It looks like I love all the recipes there, just looking at their titles. But if I just jump into a recipe book and start making recipes and haven't already learned some of the underlying cooking principles, in this case, the difference between mechanistic systems and complexity systems, I'm limiting the potential, and I'm probably obscuring some of what I can learn from the recipes. So, so what I'm always trying to do is, so when like Lisa presents this thing to me, the first thing I'm doing is I'm connecting up all the recipes to the underlying principles. I'm like, strengthening line of sight. Oh yeah, that's the purpose container. Yep, that's really important. Making thinking visible. Yep, that's surfacing what's under the surface in the iceberg. That's really important. Asking powerful questions. So I'm sort of going through that very abstract human systems dynamics equation of containers, differences, and exchanges, and seeing how are they fitting in here. Like the stewarding learning through time, that is exchanges in feedback loops. Returning learning to the system is exchanges in feedback loops. So all of these things can be distilled into much more fundamental principles. And for me, like that link between the fundamental principles, which are so abstract, it's hard to know how to apply them, and applying them in a recipe cookie cutter kind of a way, we want to have flexibility along that path. We want to like understand what's underneath so that we can say, oh, making thinking visible. And then we look at that. This is where this is one of the things that started, was we look at making thinking visible. And then I'm like, well, it's not just our thinking that we're trying to make visible with a social system map. In fact, thinking isn't even explicitly in a social system map. It's all the things we can't see, like the relationships and the interactions and the beliefs and the values, et cetera. So that's where I went. And so Lisa and I didn't get far in our actual plan of what are we going to actually do and apply, because we sort of opened up this can of worms about what's important. Like, what is it we're really trying to do in this context? And for me, I'm not trying to get us to learn a recipe or a bunch of recipes from a cookbook. I'm trying to get us to learn how to have flexibility to take the fundamental principles and apply them in new contexts, especially if you think that in terms of organizing people and getting people mobilized towards purpose. Most of our recipes come from systems of dominance. And so we're creating new recipes out of new fundamental underlying principles. And we have lots of people espousing things that have worked in their context for them, or that they've learned in specific kinds of situations. And so it's very valuable to have some starting points, but we're not nowhere near to the point where we can say, we've got this all figured out. And especially when it comes to social system mapping, how do we take these recipes and apply them to a map? Because none of them were designed to be applied to a map. That's our job. That's what we're working to, is how do we take these principles and apply them to maps and make recipes that we can share with other people. So that's a lot of talking. And
Christine, it makes me ask the question. Well, Brian put in here, it looks like a first order change recipe. Makes sense. And it actually makes me want to ask you the question, when is it okay to use recipes in social system mapping?
Well, okay, with social system
if
mapping,
ever.
well, with social system mapping, there are very few recipes. The only recipes I recognize as recipes for social system mapping come from social network analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And those are fine to use if they answer questions that you actually have about the network. Like if you actually need to know who are the bridgers, then it's great to use the bridger recipe. If you need to know where we add in our developmental process, it's great to use a social network analysis recipe for that. But for the larger potential of social system mapping, there aren't any yet. And so the one thing that I get concerned about is when people say, here's the recipe for social system mapping, or here's the activity, as if that's all there is. Because then what we're doing is we're collapsing down the potential and we're collapsing down our what we're actually looking for when we're thinking. So I think it's great to use those recipes, but really there's a lot more recipes that we need to create to actually use a social system map the way it could be. And that's our biggest challenge. That's our big endeavor. Good question.
Jim just put in the chat, wouldn't the visual directory kinds of views of a social system map be simple recipes, not very rich, but useful?
Yeah, I mean, that's an example. Yeah, I mean.
But then Brian said more ingredients than recipe in my mind.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. And we can open up and just have conversation. I know you're putting it in chat, but I think this might be a good place to see what other questions you're having or thoughts you're having as we talk through this. You can just open your mic and speak.
Maybe that would.
Jim.
Twice in a row here, chat and verbal. As you started out, Christine, I was thinking that you were, and Lisa, that you were thinking about emergent learning as a particular theory of change, and that you were saying, okay, here's how we take any theory of change, that or other ones, and use it in our social system mapping theory of transformation, and that theory of change informs that network leadership group in the center, filter how they observe, how they filter the questions they ask, what they put into the map. I thought that's where you were going, but then, and was that part of where you were going?
Well,
I mean, that's the like one layer up that we were thinking about for this is like, well, let's use this as an example of how do you look at different approaches. And I don't know if I'd call it a theory of change. I don't know enough about it, or if it's just a framework of a collection of recipes yet. But is it like, how would you look at something? Because there's a lot of models coming out, right? And so it's more like this, how do you look at something? Is it useful? Is it a useful frame? Now, that could be a good question to ask it. Is it a theory of change? That puts it on a different level for me. That would make it a more systemic approach than a recipe. But I don't know. What do you think, Christine?
Well, Jim, interrupt me if you feel like I'm going in the wrong direction, but in response to your question, but when I was reading about the Emergent Learning Principles, they also said that they feel like that any theory of change can fit into the Emergent Learning model. So it's in a way, it's a support mechanism for enacting a theory of change, which I would say a social system map is also a support mechanism for enacting a theory of change. But this one is one kind and a social system map is another kind. And anytime we in this community try to take any recipe book, so we'll just call it a framework or a recipe book, it has, as Brian has pointed out, a lot of first order principles, and they're generally, well, they're never customized to be explicitly used with a social system map, because that's not what those frameworks are about. They're not about how do we do better social system mapping. And so it's always the case that we have to look to the fundamental principles and then try to figure out how this can help us think about social system, applying social system mapping, and also help us think about the second and the third order and the fourth and the fifth order impacts. So there's a lot here, and maybe Jim, that's not really answering your question.
No, it's fine.
It is what you're pointing to is the difference between applying something and thinking about something, and thinking about it from more angles, more deeply, and coming back to it over and over. That's a big piece of what I feel like. If we're just looking, we're often just evaluating the application step and not the deeper thinking and thinking about more further impacts out. But Brian's got his hand up, so.
Yeah. A lot of times when we talk about transforming the system, and we're looking and said not just changing systems, which is like rearranging the chairs in the Titanic, but actually transforming the system so the Titanic turns into an ice cutter and it goes through the iceberg. We talk about being in systems of VUCA, okay, volatile, unknown, the complex, whatever. But there sometimes seems to be a sense that when we make these changes that we're talking about with the systems map or emergent learning, we get out of VUCA, but we don't. We're going to still be in VUCA, okay? So whatever we come up with, we need to have recipes, tools, ingredients, whatever it is, to be able to survive in VUCA. We have to be able to make, it's like we have to start thinking, instead of just different kinds of cooking, Asian fusion, putting different things together. But that's hard for people, because people are used to having their hot dogs and hamburgers and don't really want to talk about, doing other things. So anyway, I'm done. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Lisa, what do you think where should we head?
Just checking if there's other thoughts or questions. And then we thought we'd maybe go into smaller groups just to kind of keep digging into this. So we have a few prompting questions for you, but just see if there's other things coming up before we do that. And I see Katie has to leave too. The other place we could go, Christine, is to dig into that one principle and just some of the things that we were thinking about with that, like showing the chemistry behind it. We were going to do that with the thinking, making thinking visible. Would that be helpful, or would you rather go into groups and just do a little bit more exploring? Should we ask the group?
Yeah, let's see where people are at with just like, is this like too much? Is your head tired of where's your?
Looks like people are kind of heading out here at the top of the hour.
Okay. Okay. Brian, what was the?
You like the second choice of digging into one of the principles?
Yeah,
Brian?
I'm going to keep us all together and have more
Yeah.
ideas come in rather than being split up.
How's that sounding, everybody? Looking okay. Okay. So Christine, should we dig into the making thinking visible one a little bit? Because you had some good insights about that one, about lowering the what would be the the science of cooking behind that recipe of making thinking visible. You want to do that, or you want to keep going with something else?
Yeah. Well, okay, so we can do that. And I think that in terms of, like, I was looking at the whole framework and I was just sort of like matching up each principle. And I didn't think super hard about the making thinking visible. We talked about using an example. And so maybe I'll just share the example. Does that work? Rather than.
Yeah, there were several examples we talked about within that one.
Yeah.
And that it's not just thinking, but it's
Right.
making, and that how the map can really help with that, making things visible. Yeah. So that's what.
So, well, I'm sorry. That was like, in my mind, 5 things, and I don't know how to do all of them at once without yammering a whole lot. So I'm trying to.
Let's just step back for a minute. What would be most helpful? So we're at the point right now, we're like looking at a new framework, seeing what can apply. We're sort of looking at the applying versus thinking about it, and wondering, like, I feel like you might have a sense, Christine, of what would be most helpful to keep talking about with a fuller group here.
So just so everybody, I'm going to call this out explicitly. Lisa and I are sort of planning together and adjusting as we go, which is an important capacity to have in VUCA contexts. And so we're working on our comfort level with having an overall intention and feeling our way into it and holding a plan lightly. And so that's what's going on here. And I'm noting how my brain wants to respond and how it would probably be better for it to respond. And so I'm getting stuck with Lisa's instructions for me. So I'm just acknowledging all of that. Also modeling things like being vulnerable and whatever.
And I love it because you're making your thinking visible right now. And so if you just throw out whatever. I mean, if you just want me to dive in here to the making thinking visible, and we dive and do that.
Let's do
Let's do that. Okay.
Just point out.
Well,
before you do, wait, Lisa, can I just point out one thing that happened, that Lisa and I operate cognitively super differently. Like, we are like really big opposites. And so there's always this sort of big, not friendly, loving cognitive tension between us. And so that's also part of what's going on. Like when Lisa says do X and Y and Z, like I don't even understand what she's talking about. So, so that's another systemic thing, is being aware of our differences and utilize and leaning on them rather than being stuck in them. Okay.
Well, it makes me want to ask the group, is there anything, as you look at this emergent learning model, and as we think about applying new models to SenseMaking for the map, is there anything that that is standing out to you that would either be helpful or not? Or like, I just want to check in with the group and sort of where we are right now. And then I'll go into the one principle, if there's nothing coming up.
I say dive in.
Yeah.
I'm saying dive in.
So I'm going to share my screen. Well, let's just take that one. When Christine and I were looking at making thinking visible, we thought it might be useful as one more layer to look at the recipe versus the chemistry behind it. And the recipe is making thinking visible, and they're suggesting things like finding the ideas and the reasoning behind things, the what and the why, helping other people understand each other's thinking. And when Christine saw that, she's like, well, it's not just thinking, this is the systemic principle, the science of the cooking behind this recipe is really lowering the waterline, right? Understanding what's underneath the surface and being able to expose more of that. It's not just thinking. And that when we really take time in our communities to do that, the learning we do come up with. And so Christine, and then when we were talking about that, you had come up with some really good examples. of that gets at more the science of the cooking versus just applying the recipe.
So should I go to an example?
Yes.
Cool. So this is actually the, I don't know if you can, I can't show it to you. Okay. I have, if ever I'm standing up and you're here, there's a old flipboard paper behind my desk above my little pots and stuff that has a little causal loop diagram map. And that is with Post-its and lines. And that is actually the starting point of everything that we're doing. It was about, I made that map nearly 20 years ago. Tim and I was working on my master's degree in organizational leadership and had just gotten introduced to the theory of constraints, which is a mapping modality to understand causal loops or causal effects, not just first order, but second, third, fourth, fifth order. And so I had just learned this mapping thing, and Tim and I were at a really difficult point in our marriage. We've been married for 33 years, I think now. And, you know, all marriages have their ups and downs. And that was one of those really down places where we were really struggling. And I said, let's try and do this map with our marriage. So we made Post-its for all of the undesirable effects that were going on, like, you know, blaming and not liking, and then, you know, bad communication and unmet needs and bad sex and like this whole, I don't know, about 12 to 15 Post-its with words on it that were the bad things in our marriage. And then we started saying, okay, well, this leads to this, and this leads, and this was like a whole day project. I thought it would take us 10 minutes, but I didn't think it would really go very far. But we had this very deep conversation and about how that leads to that, and then that makes this, and, you know, hurt feelings, and et cetera, et cetera. And Tim had been raised in a context where there's things you don't talk about, like there's stuff that is dangerous and you don't talk about that stuff. And I kind of had always known that there was stuff he didn't talk about, et cetera, but was not raised in that kind of a context, but we never could talk about that. And so we talked about all this other stuff, and we made all these arrows, and they all pointed to bad communication. I mean, they all pointed to everything basically, but when we really dug into it, we got to bad communication, and we said, okay, we need to work on communicating better and more. And that started a whole new phase of our marriage. Tim felt like this was the most magical thing that had ever happened. This was like, he thought system map, so this is system mapping. And whenever I do anything and I get stuck, he says, I think you should make a system map. You know, like, I think you should do that, because it was so magical and so powerful. And honestly, it's been pretty much uphill ever since. I'm not saying there aren't bad times, but the degree of challenge is like, you know, small percentages compared to that. And that was just the magic in that has been something that drives both of us ever since, of being able to really dig in and see what's going on that we're not, you know, that's hidden, or the beliefs that are hiding things, and surface that and work with that. So that's how we got here, and that's an example. And that's why it's always behind my chair. So that was one.
It's a great example.
I think there are examples like that all the time. Like in all of the challenges I see, I always feel like there's hidden stuff, whether it's hidden relationships or hidden roles in a system. There's hidden stuff that we just aren't looking for. And if we would look for it and find it, it would make a huge difference.
So how are you connecting that with the principle? When you see the principle of emergent learning, it's not deep enough because it's just about the thinking and actions. It's not about showing what's been obscured between your views. I want to connect it back to that principle.
Well, so the making thinking visible, to me, I interpret that as just making what's hidden or what's unseeable. So for instance, if we think about the network horizon concept, right? We can't see beyond our own network horizons. We can't see, I don't know, like, do Denise and Amy have a strong, powerful relationship that is impacting what we're doing? I mean, I know Denise and I know Amy, but I don't yet know what their relationship is, or there's a handful of you that I know each other, but when we get a few, add a few more people, pretty soon, I don't really know the relationships that are present and how those relationships, what they consist of, and how they're impacting our ability either to be more trusting or less trusting, or just like how they're impacting the group. I can't see that. A social system map can help me begin to have a sense of that. And the more sophisticated questions we put into the social system map, the more I could understand that, and then I could make conscious choices around, maybe I need to talk with those two and see if there's something I could be doing differently, or whatever it is. So that's, if we can't see it, we can't impact it, we can't influence it. If we can have a sense of it, even if it's just like pointing in that direction in the dark, we can start to move there and say, I want to understand this better so that I can influence it. And that's true of relationships, it's true of beliefs, it's true of backgrounds, it's true of identities, it's true of values, it's true of purposes. Is that helping or not?
How do we sense and know what we don't know?
We don't.
How do we even know that there's anything invisible there to see? What's the sign of that?
Well, if we go to HSD pattern spotting, it would be places that surprise us, or places that always feel stuck. Like with Tim and I would try to talk about something and he wouldn't. And so it was just a constant sticking point. So constant sticking points, surprises, things that are unexpected, or things that if you have some kind, so with a social system map, or even with any kind, like with a system map, if you ask other people, what are they perceiving, then you'll discover what they're experiencing that you aren't experiencing. So any kind of mechanism that helps us look at together, visualize or surface from different perspectives can help with that. So that's why good questions, why powerful questions are so important, because they help us look for what we don't know yet.
Mm-hmm. And so HSD it feels like we keep going back to the human systems dynamics models and methods, because it feels like that's where we get at the science of things versus a recipe.
Yeah. Yeah. It's where we get the Glenda said, it's like so abstract. It's a little like E equals MC squared, it's that
Right.
abstract, but it does help you boil it down. Brian saying the problem is that there's often not a need for sense making being realized, and that that is the fundamental problem. is the problem that we're trying to work with. And that's, for me, because I just naturally am always sort of flailing around in the dark looking for what I don't know. But so for me, like, all these recipes help me think of, like, there's one little step towards that. Like, how have other people, worked with this general stance of what's there to make sense of? I know what the universe is and I've got all the answers. I mean, I need recipes to help break through that thinking. Recipe as a checkoff list. Do you want to say more about that, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, the sense I get when I'm even my own group that I'm working with right now is like we're going through and trying to do the 9 boundaries, planetary boundaries and the social foundations. And they're trying to define them and doing a checkoff list. Okay, we get this one done, we get that one done, we get that, and thinking that as soon as I got this list, I can put that out there and the change is going to come, and not understanding the contextual relationships between all of them together. And it's like, well, if we can just get this law passed, then everything is going to change. And then, no, that's not going to make the difference, because what's underlying to create the conditions is still going to be there. And just changing the law is not going to be enough.
Yeah. And there's another way, though, I think of recipes as, or like a good framework. Like, I think this Emergent Learning Framework looks fairly good. A good framework will provide us with a checkoff list to help us assess what are we leaving out? What angle haven't we
Yeah.
looked? And so it can be, even a checkoff list can be really helpful if we're used to noticing, items 5 to 9, and we never think about items 1 to 4. If we have a checkoff list, then we go, oh yeah, there's item 1. Oh yeah, there's item 2. And that those are used as good deepening question prompts.
But the checkoff list is never complete.
No, it's never complete. It's not adequate. It always has to be, and it always has to be, you have to think hard about how to apply it in this particular context. Yeah.
I have an unformed thought, but I think a recipe can help, can be an entry point into helping people with systemic thinking. So I've used the before action review process for a group that I wanted to build more ownership. And it was a pretty open process, but we did a before action review. And if you do a before action and after action, you're helping a group get, rather than just do the checklist of we had our meeting and we made our progress, to actually step back and say, what did we learn in the dynamics of having that meeting? So I think that's another place the recipe can help enter into the deeper understanding the science. It's where we can experiment with the science of cooking.
Yeah.
It's a basic thought, but
Yeah.
helpful for me.
So
Other questions or thoughts? Yeah, go ahead, Christine.
I'm just noticing that there are some people we haven't heard from at all, and I'm wondering if any of them are having thoughts coming up or questions or concerns that they want to share.
We've talked about sort of issues and maybe what we're not seeing or recipes, but we haven't talked about what we don't see that is working.
Mm-hmm.
So, because sometimes there are great things happening or small shifts, and we're sort of blind to them, or just sort of cast them off or don't see them.
Yeah. Anyone else, especially people who aren't here a lot and who generally don't speak up or are new to the context? No pressure if you don't want to, but want to make sure you feel comfortable, or invite you to feel comfortable saying whatever.
I'll say something. I think what made sense to me is, we're trying to help people think differently, way differently than they have. And a lot of the exercises and recipes just feel like an extension of the mechanistic mindset. Like we can still control. If we do these recipes well, if we do the before after well enough, we're still in control. And so I think, Lisa, it can be a step,
Right.
but without it really intent, it'll feel like a false victory.
Yeah.
And actually solidifies the old way.
Yeah.
So that's a concern.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear that for sure. So what my question for that is, then what are ways we've seen work to not fall back into the old trap? Like what is the discerning moment when if we use, where the line of usefulness for a recipe versus having it fall back into the old mechanistic way?
One of the things I've noticed doing maps with other people is that to really have people feel the change through the map, they have to be part of the map making process itself. If you make the map and show it to somebody, it never has the same impact as when you actually have them be part of the process. But even when you have them be part of the process, they can still have their own perspectives and go around in their own separate ways. And it's like it's supposed to be another level that needs to be made of bringing people together. And maybe that's where a social map comes in, that it's not the map of the change you're looking for, but it's the map of the people who are making the change to, in order, how do they make that change?
Yeah, and it's like having the recipe be out, like make sure it's open enough within using that recipe that the change can happen within that. Because like the example I'm just thinking of, using a recipe of a before action review act, it actually changed what we were doing.
Yeah.
It actually changed something that people kind of had an idea of what they were going to do, and it totally changed our agenda for what we were going to do that for that time. So there's something in there that we have to be watching for, so it doesn't swing us back. But that's the kind of question I would hold, because I don't know what the answer is for that either. But like that participation, that like open to whatever happens, like we did today, right? Like whatever happens in the moment.
Whatever you do, there's going to be a feedback from doing that, which you have to take.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Jim.
I'm thinking that in all of these things, there's the subjective to objective shift, the idea of getting up on the balcony. And I'm just thinking all of these things sort of are ways to get up on the balcony. As soon as you shift from like, I'm in it, I'm doing it, that's the life, to, oh, I'm noticing me doing that or you doing that. You've gone from first order to second or multiple orders beyond that. And that shift, that awareness. So you can do it through meditation. You can do it through looking at a map. You can do it through any of these recipes. You can do it through questions. You can do it through all of these different things are ways of messing with that shift, drawing a causal loop diagram, which we know is a super powerful thing, to be able to shift out of purely from the subjective up to some other level. And I'm not quite sure how it relates to the map, because the map I've always thought of as, yeah, that's a way to get up on the balcony. But there are a lot of ways to get up on the balcony. You just see specific things when you use these maps.
Keeping in mind, there's probably already an existing balcony above you.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well,
second, third, fourth.
and the thing that I feel the need to say is that it's never done. So any recipe you use, you have to be examining the recipe. You have to be looking, is there a zoomed in or zoomed out context? And you have to do it again. It's a practice. It's all of it is not a one-time thing. And, like we've had this map forever, and I keep being reminded by people like Mary and Tom and Brian and Jim to look at the map. It's like, you looked at the map, 6 months ago, and you looked at the map this week. I mean, how does it? It's a practice, just like meditation is a practice. It's not like you can do it once and your mind has changed. It's like we have to do it over and over and over, and always be looking like this, like from multiple angles, using, grabbing recipes, trying them and throwing them out, or adding to. So it's a constant, like how we have to think in VUCA is a VUCA way of, is to think VUCA-ly and not ever think that we're done. That's my thing.
Another thought that's been coming to my mind and raises here, and it has before, is that it is extremely difficult to make useful, practical, concrete changes. We can do all these maps and we can do all this other things, but actually going into the world and making a real change in the world that's practical and concrete is a very, very difficult.
And that's why we need networks, but we don't know how to make networks work yet. I mean, we understand that it's going to take lots of people changing their minds together in certain ways to get where we need to be, but we haven't learned how to think together. And we haven't learned how to, we're just some of us, but it's a very new cutting edge thing, is learning how to stay focused on the change and build relationships and have an understanding of how to make the changes what we want to make, all of those together. And keep in mind all the progress that we are making and all of the successes that we have had and all the wonderfulness that there is. as well as all the things we want to change.
That was a question I hoped Emergent Learning would answer, but I don't know that it does, is how do you capture or even know when something's emerged that needs to be paid attention to and potentially codified and celebrated? I'm not sure how that works.
What's popping into my mind is simply frequently asking collectively, part of the practice. But Jem, you were going to say something.
Well, yeah, I mean, oftentimes emergence, an indicator of emergence is that it's at a different ontological level, that it is not of the same ilk. It's something that could only have come together at a, now I'm stuck, but yeah, it's just not a I stands down.
I'm a little bit apprehensive about the word emergent in this context. I mean, I think they're trying to use it as a selling point rather than a proper definition of the word emergent. I haven't looked at it yet, but I mean, I'm just a little bit skeptical.
Yeah. Just doing a little time check, Christine. About 3 minutes left.
Yeah. What do you think?
I'm ready to jump.
You're
Yeah,
ready.
it seems like we're kind of ready to wrap.
Should we do our little, so for those of you who are new, we have a
Yeah.
little by ritual, which is for you two. And I just need to, I'm going to point this out simply because I'm becoming aware of it, is most of our conversation today has been me and Lisa, who are the authorized leaders or facilitators, and men, with a little tiny chime in from Mary. And so I'm just noting this difference, and I've been taking it as new people not feeling comfortable enough yet. I mean, so there's also not only a difference gender, but also experience level with this context. And I'm not criticizing anybody or making any blame, but I'm just noticing that I would be happy if we could work towards a more gender blended input context. Because this is one of the
pointing
things,
that out.
this is one of the things that when I see this happening in other groups, if I saw this pattern in any other group and I hadn't already built trust with it, I would not go back, because I think there's a really difference between how men process this and how women process this stuff. And if I'm not getting to hear from the women, I'm feeling like it's icky. So just and I feel a little culpable or a little bit
Me too.
complicit in this pattern that we've seen emerge. So I have to say it out loud. Still not blaming. There's no blame. There's no criticism. It's just a noticing of a pattern. Okay. Shall we do our goodbye ritual is we all unmute, everyone who wants to do this. And Denise, I know you can't, but we all unmute. I count down 3, 2, 1, and then we just all give each other our best wishes and blessings and love for the day. And we all go away feeling each other's support and energy. So unmuted, 3, 2, 1. Thank you all.
Good to
Thank
be
you.
with you.
Have a good week. It was great to
Bye.
see you all. Be with
Thank
you.
you.